This program is made possible in part by the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, one of America's top research universities, preparing students for today's interdependent world with internationally focused academic and outreach programs. The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents International Focus, a weekly discussion of the people and events behind today's global headlines. Now, here's your host, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus and another chapter in the ongoing drama that is Brexit. Newly minted British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has already suffered an eyebrow-raising number of parliamentary setbacks that reflect the collision course he's on with the nation's legislative and judicial branches. With characterizations like unprecedented and uncharted waters having long since become passé when describing the Brexit process, the road ahead seems shrouded in a particularly dense London fog. With Parliament suspended, new elections being argued over, and the latest and possibly final Brexit deadline looming, we're fortunate to welcome the return of just the man to sort it all out. Timothy McMahon is Associate Professor of History at Marquette University, where his research and teaching focus on national identity, imperialism, and popular culture in the UK and Ireland. An historian by training, he's also a keen observer of current events in that part of the world, and will no doubt provide flawless prognostication on what lies ahead. Tim, welcome back.
Thank you, Doug.
No pressure, no pressure.
Seriously.
So there's a term I've heard bandied about recently. I'm wondering if you're suffering from. It's EU exit fatigue.
I'm actually energized by all this, Doug. It's head spinning. You know, I mean, it seems every day, and in fact, for the last few weeks, it has been every day, sometimes multiple times a day. The story just keeps changing. And so it is fatiguing, and certainly there are people in the UK, particularly among the pro-Brexit voters, who are at the point where they're saying, let's just get on with this, because of the various fumbles and stumbles that have been made. So I'm not there yet, but it gives me a reason to come back to International Focus.
Well, and we're glad you did. And I'm wondering if you could tell us how what's going on now with the suspended Parliament and some of the other things, how that differs from what we would see in a more typical autumn period. Because typically Parliament does take a break around this time of year. Right?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, the idea of proroguing Parliament is not unusual in the sense that there are often suspensions, usually between sessions, right? So one will find a suspension that takes place even if an election is called early. So when Theresa May called for an election in 2017, Parliament was prorogued to go on to the election, but that was triggered by the vote to go to an election. In this case, they are doing something that is very unusual in the fall season. There is usually a couple of weeks break during the run-up to the Queen's speech. So the Queen's speech kicks off the next session of Parliament. And generally speaking, what happens is the Prime Minister and the Cabinet have drafted the policies that they're hoping to bring forward during the next session. And the Queen lays that program, that platform, if you will, out at the beginning of the session. The weeks leading up to that, there often are party conferences that take place. That's sort of the norm. But what made this so unusual was that you have a brand new Prime Minister who had been at the question box for exactly one day, and then went to the Queen and asked for an early prorogation, essentially a 5-week break. And what made that especially provocative is that it would cut off discussion of this monumental change that's being brought forward, the whole idea of leaving the European Union, at a time when the new Prime Minister is trying to shift gears on the approach to the European Union. So does Parliament play a role in terms of examining that program? it seemed that the Prime Minister was trying to stifle that very important role that Parliament traditionally would play.
So let's just talk about some of the highlights in the last few weeks. 21 Tory members of Parliament, the Prime Minister's own colleagues in the same party, were basically expelled. What was that about?
So you need to think about the parliamentary math for just a minute. When Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, he did so because Theresa May had resigned her position. Her position had become untenable as the leader of her party and, by extension, the Prime Minister. There was a leadership vote within the Conservative Party, which saw Boris Johnson becoming the new party leader and the new Prime Minister once that position was approved by the Crown. But he still inherited the parliamentary math that Theresa May left. And that is that in conjunction with the votes of the Democratic Unionist Party, a small party in the grand scheme of the United Kingdom, representing districts in the north of Ireland, in conjunction with the votes that the DUP would give, the government had a one-vote majority. And maintaining control over those votes is vital to the Prime Minister, any Prime Minister in that situation, getting their plan forward. And you saw in the first days of the shortened session of Parliament a discussion about whether or not to bring forward what became known as the Ben Bill, a bill which would have prevented the government from threatening no deal with the European Union, simply walking away in the Brexit process. As that bill was about to be debated, as the motion to bring it to the floor was about to be debated, one member of the Conservative Party offered his resignation, and he literally walked across the floor as the Prime Minister was speaking. That was Philip Lee. He sat down with the Liberal Democrats, and it seems that he would run as a Liberal Democrat if there were an election campaign. But then when the vote came up, 21 other Tories, under the threat that they would lose their status within the party, still voted against the Prime Minister. And so he told his party officials that they could no longer go under the Conservative Party whip. So suddenly you're looking at 22 votes having left. And then even after that, a member of his own cabinet, Amber Rudd, resigned over last weekend. And so you're looking at 23 people actually having left. So the parliamentary math does not look good for the Prime Minister.
So one of the other interesting little data points, there was a lawsuit alleging that the lengthened suspension was not on the up and up, shall we say. And
right.
So tell us where that stands, right?
Well, so the case was brought actually in two different jurisdictions. This would be akin to, let us say, different parties suing an American government, bringing forward a case, say, in one district court, one federal district court, and then also in another federal district court, possibly with slight variation on the cases being brought. In the High Court in London, the government actually won the day. The High Court saying this is a matter for politics, the court shouldn't be involved. But in the Court of Sessions up in Edinburgh, members of Parliament associated with the Scottish National Party brought a suit, and in fact, former Prime Minister John Major was also, if you will, a friend of the court on that case as well, essentially saying that the effort to prorogue Parliament was being done under false pretenses, and that also the government was going to have to abide by the Ben Bill, which had already become law. It had been passed three times, and the Queen had offered her assent. Because there was concern that, in fact, the Prime Minister would just ignore the Ben Act. And the Scottish court, just this week, made their decision that, in fact, the government lost. And so now there's a very quick process where in the following week, it is being appealed by the government to the Supreme Court back in London. And we'll see. I mean, I would actually be very surprised if the Supreme Court came down against the government on this. On the other hand, if they ignore the decision of the Scottish court, that might also upset Scots who are already upset about the whole idea of Brexit, and might, sort of fan the flames of even calls for a Scottish referendum for independence.
So one of the other big issues being debated and being strategized among the parties is new elections. So what is the strategy from Labor's perspective, from Boris Johnson's perspective? Who would benefit from a snap election, who would not?
Right. This is where we get really deep into the weeds. So if you had asked me this question even before the discussion of the Ben bill, now the Ben Act, I would have said that, generally speaking, the polls are supportive of the government, of the Conservative Party. They still seem to lean that way. If an election went forward, it seems that what Mr. Johnson was banking on was that he would hold off on the question of no deal, that he maintains, I am negotiating with the European Union, but regardless of what they say, we are going to leave on October 31st, which is the deadline to have things sorted.
Well,
anyway.
and he colorfully said he would rather be dead in a ditch than not meeting that deadline.
Yes, a phrase which actually received quite a bit of attention along the Irish border, where the threat of violence is in the air if there is a no-deal Brexit. But what Johnson seems to have been banking on is that Labor, which has actually been kind of hoping for an election at some point, would agree to an election. But something very interesting happened in the course of the past couple of weeks. And I think Labor strategists and in conjunction with the other parties that opposed no deal, this includes the Liberal Democrats, it includes the SNP, they essentially said, we're going to leave you stewing your own juices on this. We're going to try and take away no deal and call your bluff. And they're able to do that because of a change in British law that came about in 2011 called the Fixed Term Parliament Act, which essentially says you need 2/3 of the House of Commons to endorse a snap election. Back in the day, a prime minister could have called for a snap election, having lost, let us say, 1 or 6 votes in such short order. Now he needs the endorsement of 2/3 of the House of Commons, and he has not gotten that. He might get it during the window of time right after the Queen's speech. We will see. But by then, a whole lot more information will be known. We'll know, for instance, whether or not any negotiations are actually being done with the European Union Commission. So far, nothing serious actually has occurred there.
So if things stay as they are now and nothing is overturned, what is that timeline? We know the October 31st is the deadline, supposedly, for Brexit. When does Parliament return, if nothing changes?
Well, if nothing changes, October 14th is when the Queen's speech is scheduled. That opens the next session. Essentially, the timeline that Johnson put out there when he announced that he was going to prorogue Parliament was that you would have this break from early September to October 14th with the Queen's speech, and that by October 15th, he would need to be authorized to go to the European Union. There's a meeting of the European Union leaders in mid-October, and he would have to come to them with whatever the deal is. And by October 19th, Parliament would have to review whatever he came back with and sign off on it, or there would be no deal as of October 31st. No deal seems to be off the table, right? The Ben Act says it's off the table. And, unless Boris Johnson is really willing to go against the will of the House of Commons, he's going to have to come back either with a deal, or the House of Commons is going to be able to come back to him and say there has to be a significant change. And their will, according to the Ben Act, is ask for an extension and do some further negotiation. The EU may say no to that.
Right, and that would be my next question. I mean, what the EU's position seems to be, the deal is the deal, we're not reopening it. So how much room is there to even alter the deal that failed so miserably multiple times already.
Right. This is a fascinating element of it too, right? Because we're talking about an agreed upon, a negotiated agreement in which you've got at least two sides that are involved in the negotiation. In this case, the European Union holds a lot of cards, but so too does the United Kingdom. What the European Union has said, and indeed individual leaders within the EU have said this to Boris Johnson already. He visited Berlin to talk to Angela Merkel. He visited Paris to talk to Emmanuel Macron. And then he went to the G7 and he spoke to a number of leaders. And they all said to him, we're happy to negotiate, but we have a deal. If you want to change the deal, you need to bring back viable proposals. And so far, his negotiating team hasn't come back with anything solid. And so just today, the European Commission was talking about this, and their lead negotiator, Michel Barnier, was saying that it was their position, unless and until Britain comes back with a viable proposal, nothing changes.
Well, and at a more fundamental level, certainly Brussels has a huge stake in keeping the EU intact, and so they have an incentive to make it as painful as possible, do they
Yes.
not? So, you know, there's a position that said, why would they want to make Brexit in any way easy or convenient on the UK?
Right, right. And it's, I mean, if we think about the strategy even from the beginning, if we go back to the referendum in 2016, and we think back to where the British negotiating position started from, they, I don't think, recognized that Brussels was going to do that right away. Brussels knew they were going to have to. And if there is a central miscalculation that British negotiators made from the beginning, it was that, well, of course they're going to do everything they can to keep us as a free trade partner. And I think they felt as if there was going to be, from the European perspective, an EU perspective, still as if they were negotiating from within the European Union. But the minute that the UK voted to leave, the European Union treated them as a third state, a third party, right? You're outsiders. And so, for instance, in the withdrawal agreement, one of the elements that has been so controversial is the so-called Irish backstop. The backstop is to protect the island of Ireland, and in particular, the Republic of Ireland's position as a member of the European Union. And the EU is going to prioritize that over trying to appease British elements.
Well, and Boris Johnson actually was in Ireland, in Dublin, and meeting with the Irish Prime Minister. And one of the things that he seemed to belie, the Irish Prime Minister, was this idea of a clean break Brexit.
Right.
And he said, I'll quote here, "In my view, the story of a Brexit won't end if the UK leaves the European Union on 31 October or even 31 January. There's no such thing as a clean break or just getting it done. Rather, we will just move on to a new phase. If there's no deal, it will cause severe disruption for British and Irish people alike." So what about that? I mean, even if they were to crash out, this is just the beginning of a much longer process, is it not?
Of course, of course. The Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar, also appealed to Boris Johnson, who likes to talk about his training in the classics, and he suggested that the kind of negotiation that Boris was engaging in, hoping for a free trade agreement with the EU, a free trade agreement with the United States, and then also a clean withdrawal from the EU, that was a Herculean task. And he said, I'd like to be your friend. I would like to be your Athena. Of course, Athena essentially knocks Hercules out at one juncture to keep him from eating his young, basically, right? So this was a very pointed remark by Varadkar. He continued directly from the quotation that you're saying there, and saying, and in the process that will have to go on, we're going to begin with the very same 3 points that are in the withdrawal agreement. The European Union expects the United Kingdom to pay the money that they're owed. The European Union expects the United Kingdom to treat European Union citizens well within the UK, and vice versa. They would need to know how to handle their relationship with UK citizens, and they have to know about the Irish border. Those are the elements of the withdrawal agreement. And so before there would be any kind of trade agreement, those three things have to be done. They're already in an agreement. What are you going to do about it? And it was a fascinating moment, and it was clearly one that Mr. Johnson wasn't quite prepared to welcome. I mean, if you watched that moment, there were points where he put his head in his hands, literally leaning on his podium. At one juncture, he kind of stretched his arms out like this. You know, it was an uncomfortable time.
Well, one of the bits of electoral math that has impacted particularly the Irish backstop, you mentioned them a bit earlier, the DUP, 10 votes, which were critical for Mrs. May to maintain her majority. Now the majority is gone. Right. So how relevant are those 10 votes? And by extension, how relevant are the very strident anti-backstop feelings of the DUP? I mean, to put it bluntly, might Boris be able to just throw them under the bus at this point?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, this is actually an idea that is floating across the political spectrum in newspapers and in commentary. It's something that that Barnier from the EU side has mentioned. There's talk of, well, we have the original, so the backstop agreement that's part of the withdrawal actually is an all UK backstop. And again, just to define what we're talking about here, the idea of a backstop was put into the withdrawal agreement to ensure the free movement of goods as well as the free movement of people on the island of Ireland. These are critical elements that emerged out of not just both the UK and Ireland being in the European Union, but also out of the peace agreement known as the Belfast or Good Friday Agreement of 1998. Any sign that there would be a hardening of the border between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic is likely to destabilize that region. I mentioned people dying in ditches earlier. If one looks at the 30 years of violence that were known as the Troubles in Northern Ireland and looks at the concentrations of deaths over that 30-year span, there is a heavier concentration closer to the border than anywhere else in Northern Ireland. So what the withdrawal focused on initially was just the island of Ireland. And that was unacceptable to the Democratic Unionists. They said this to Theresa May. She needed their votes. And so she suggested, let's turn this into an all United Kingdom backstop. That if we haven't completed a trade agreement after 2 years, we're going to keep essentially things as they are until there is a formal trade agreement.
So just to take a step back, the sensibilities that offends in the north of Ireland is we're part of the UK, don't treat us differently than the rest of the UK vis-a-vis the Republic of Ireland.
Exactly. And stretch that out over the entirety of the United Kingdom. Hardline Brexiteers, they saw an all-UK backstop as essentially the European Union trying to keep us within the EU rules. And if we're no longer in their councils, we have no say in how those rules are set. And so that's one reason why the harder line Brexiteers oppose the idea of the backstop. So to today, it could be now that Boris Johnson is not dependent on those DUP votes. Maybe he resurrects the backstop, just applying to Northern Ireland. The DUP met with him the other day, and they made it clear that they still oppose that, and that if he were to go down that road, they would want to have the right to review any changes that would be made and have Belfast actually play a role in the review of things. Two elements to think about here. First, that requires the government of Northern Ireland to come back together, something that hasn't happened since 2017 when there was fallout between the two largest parties in Northern Ireland, the DUP and Sinn Féin. This would be incentive to reinvigorate the Stormont Parliament in the north, in other words. But the other element of it is the withdrawal agreement already has that into account. There is already an element of review. So, there is this possibility. As of the middle of this week, this past week. There's been no sign, though, that they're actually going to make that offer. We'll see. As I say, there's lots of chatter. Whether they make that offer or not remains to be seen.
Well, we've got probably under a minute left. I'll put you on the spot and say, where are we likely to be when Parliament returns?
I think that we're likely to find that we have not moved much from where we are today. I think Boris Johnson's government will be in place. I think they will continue to be pushing for as hard a Brexit as they can. They're going to chafe at the idea of extending past October 31st. But I do think that the House of Commons is going to try and force him to go beyond October 31st, because I don't foresee a deal coming forward. And I'd be happy to be wrong, especially on that last element.
Well, Tim McMahon, thank you as always. And I'm sure we'll need to have you back and sort this all out again. But thank you. And to our viewers, see you next time on International Focus.
This program is made possible in part by the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, one of America's top research universities, preparing students for today's interdependent world with internationally focused academic and outreach programs.